Right. Thank you for joining us, Daniel. Our guest today is a group today near me in Morecambe as a Lancaster lad. I think just a bit of background, raised in a family. First one to go to university, I think. Went to UCL, stayed for a master's, got a doctorate, got your PhD. And then this fascinates me as well because we keep bees at school here, and you modelled your early research on the brains of bumblebees, I think. We obviously keep honeybees, but slightly different. You went on to found Satalia, if I've got this right, which is an AI company that you sold to WPP, where you are still the chief global AI officer. And then I think about 100,000 people within that company or something, or responsible.
WPP, yeah.
And then you co-founded Faculty AI, which Accenture agreed to buy this year for a nice lump sum. Enough to buy Morecambe, but I suspect it's not all going to your pocket. And you now run Conscium, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Which talks about machines becoming conscious, and I've read into E17 singularities and various things like that. So if I've got all that correct, thank you for joining us. And my opening question is, you left Morecambe via an education system which hasn't really changed, to be honest, since then in many ways, but you got out in a particular moment, in a particular way. What did it give you as a learner at that age that they won't get now?
Wow. So I went to Heysham High School. I'm not even sure
Heysham
if it
High, right?
exists right now, but
It's still there, yeah.
It exists in a different form. But I don't think it was particularly highly ranked when I was studying there. I'm not sure how high it is, but one of my friends used to say that the only exciting thing that happened at school was when a dog came into the playground, and so I didn't have the greatest, and I didn't really know back then, educational experience. I was not encouraged to go to university, both by my family nor the school. In fact, when I was doing my A-levels, I was actually running a restaurant. I started washing dishes when I was 12. By the time I was 16, I was running this hotel restaurant in Morecambe. My trajectory was going to go into the army. And long story short, but I went on my first family holiday to Lanzarote when I was 16. I met a girl who lived in London. I thought, how the hell am I going to get to London? And I was failing my A-levels at the time because I wasn't really bothered. And I decided that I would go to university to get to London. And so I actually ended up doing my A-levels in the restaurant under one of the desks. I didn't go to school. I did my A-levels. I did pretty well. Girls were a good motivator for that kind of thing. I was actually actively encouraged not to go to London to university because it was going to be too expensive and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, I got to UCL and fell in love with education, and very, very fortunate to have joined UCL. There were 2 people on my course 27 years ago when I started doing AI. Things have changed a lot since then. And again, in the first year at university, I really didn't know how to educate myself. I didn't know how to pass tests. I was failing in the first year. In fact, I remember in the first year, I was pretty much failing all of my modules apart from one. And I realized that the way that I got an A on that module was because I answered the questions that were in the exam. And I know that sounds obvious, but that then made me realize and understand how to pass exams. And then the rest is history. I've continued an academic track. I've actually ran a master's program in UCL for 5 years where, I was helping students go out there applying these technologies. And I'm still very, very passionate about education.
And that's University College of London, isn't it?
UCL. Yeah, absolutely.
UCL to me is University of Central Lancashire.
Yes, University College.
Which ironically, one of our friends has just got a PhD. Let me get this. You probably help me here. She's got a PhD in artificial intelligence with a focus in EdTech from the Preston UCL, hasn't she?
She has. Yes, that's lovely. Yeah,
but not UCL. Yours. Okay.
It's a geographical thing. If you're south of probably the M62, UCL is immediately thought of as a London university. My daughter went to King's, so they're kind of rivals. And then if you're north of it, you start thinking of Central Lancashire. Yeah.
Well, I actually applied to King's as well. I was very interested in first of all getting to London, and King's was my second choice, and I was interested in physics and theoretical physics, but I again ended up in being involved in AI. And fortunately, UCL has become probably one of the
fantastic space there for AI.
Sorry?
I say UCL now is kind of right up there when it comes to like density of people who are kind of thinking and challenging.
Exactly. I mean, I still live very close, and King's Cross, which is near UCL here in London, is arguably becoming the centre of the universe for AI talent.
You mentioned getting to London. It hasn't changed, Daniel. People say to me, pop down to London for this conference for a day. And you're like, well, I can't, the trains don't run. It's an 8-hour round trip at best. So yeah, it hasn't changed. I
did feel a little bit like Oliver, if I'm honest. And I'd sort of saved up like £1,000 and that went in the first 7 days of being in London. So I got a job while I was here, and which was helping in parallel to my degree in helping run networks and build software for companies. So yeah, I paid my way through university through building software.
Were they spiking neural networks, Daniel?
I didn't really come to spiking neural networks, which, for the audience that are listening, there's the way that currently AIs are built is that they're sort of trained on the corpus of the internet, on the text of the internet, and they're crude representations of how our brain works. Our brain operates on the power of a light bulb. We don't need a nuclear power station to run our brain, and we learn very, very quickly. We adapt very quickly. There are many innovations that are being developed in academia based on some of the research that I was looking at 20 years ago and now reinvesting in, that are looking at how biological brains work and then use that as inspiration to build more adaptive, more intelligent AIs. In fact, I've got a few books here from my university. My first book at university was the Artificial Intelligence: A Modern Approach by a famous guy called Stuart Russell, who's one of the godfathers of AI. And this was my course text at UCL, and Spikes, which is all about how our brain actually processes information.
I mean, education is what, 14 to 18 years minimum in an institution. I'm not sure about the word institution, but when you look at enjoyment levels of education, maybe institution is the right word. And then you've got to go to university and for at least 3 to 5 years for a degree and pay a lot of money. And it's in exchange for a promise of employment. Is that still a relevant pathway? And is that transaction still honest?
Do you know what? I think
you are?
It's a super relevant question, and I've been asking this question as well. So, recently I was actually in Greece. I've got some of my team in Greece, and I was asking them, who are currently in education, kind of what's going on in the education system in Greece. And interestingly, a lot of the students out there that are not going to university, they're realizing that actually they want to go and get a job. They want to get money because there's no guarantee that if they went to university in 3 years' time, they're going to have a job. And I actually don't think that is the wrong answer in many cases. I think that my worry is that the pace that we educate people, the way that we educate people is not aligned with the rapidly changing world, and getting first-hand experience, being able to adapt to this changing world outside the system in some cases might be the right solution, which is a shame because I think there's still a massive role to play for the academic institutes.
We often talk about the pace of change, Daniel, particularly around the technology, and we worry about that in terms of the curriculum and jobs that are going to feature. But you take that blue book that you bought off the shelf. Although AI is developing at a crazy pace, actually many of those foundations in that book, I'm guessing, are still entirely valid as part of the conversation.
100%. I think having foundational knowledge is crucial. It's one of the reasons why WPP actually acquired my company, because they knew that people that have deep foundational understanding of algorithms are able to make better decisions. I know that everybody has rebranded themselves as AI experts over the past 3 years. Even 10 years isn't long enough to really deeply understand these technologies. I've been doing this for almost 3 decades and still only scratched the surface. But foundational knowledge is crucial in making sure that we make good decisions. But the question then is, how do you impart that knowledge in a way that is efficient, effective, and quick?
You reference
and I guess relevant. Sorry, Matt. I was just going to say and relevant, because I think there's another little layer there, isn't there, potentially, which is everyone's kind of focused on the evolution of AI, and then it becomes agentic, and now it becomes AGI, and yet actually the core fundamentals of how we use the systems in the future and what that might look like in terms of curriculum and children understanding the basics about how it works, that isn't changing particularly heavily, is it?
No, will it change? I think for example, I would recommend people go and learn very quickly about computational complexity. I know that sounds like a big word, but if you go and Google big O notation, essentially big O notation is trying to understand the complexity of algorithms and or the complexity of how hard it is to solve problems. And that is fundamental mathematics. That there are many, many problems that exist in industry that are fundamentally impossible to solve efficiently. And being able to spot those problems and understand what the right algorithms are to solve those problems will persist for many, many years. And so, going back to this point, is understanding the fundamentals is crucial in making sure you make good decisions.
Would you like to just go over that again?
Yeah. There's a professor called Daniel Ariely from, I think, Duke or Yale, I can't remember. He's written many books on human behavior. One of them is called Predictably Irrational. And Daniel Ariely 10 years ago was talking about big data. He said, big data is like teenage sex. People think other people are doing it. People say they're doing it, but the reality is nobody's doing it. And actually, the promise of big data, the promise of getting all your data together and then extracting insights that might somehow deliver value was just nonsense. And anybody in the field will have known it was nonsense. But it was a very good story, and it fit on a PowerPoint slide, so it was easy to sell by the big technology consultancy companies. 10 years later, people's data is not ready. Arguably, AI agents are still in the teenage sex phase. Everybody thinks that the people doing agents. They're really not. And I'm at the cold face. I would caveat that by saying that there are some people doing it, but they're doing it badly. And so what I'm interested in is making sure that people build agents, deploy agents in a way that allows them to augment their own skills, their own capability, to allow them to become superhuman, and also that organizations adopt them in a way that actually drives real value. And again, unfortunately, 99% of the stuff I see coming out of the large tech consultancies, etc., is just nonsense, and people are going to make bad decisions. So again, going back to this idea of having foundational knowledge allows you to scratch the surface of whether these people actually know what they're talking about, and make sure you place the right bets.
So where's that starter for 10 on that, Daniel? When people and businesses are looking and thinking, yeah, we're making progress here. We've got some things that are automatically engaging with other systems. Where do you look at that and say, look, here's the first bit of the rule book you need to reconsider or reinvent?
This is going to sound so noddy and obvious, but you always start with a problem. I know that sounds noddy, but the reality is that people get very excited about emerging technologies. 10 years ago, it was data science, data lakes. Now it's generative AI. They get told to deploy these technologies as fast as possible to satisfy their shareholders. But the reality is that people are often not very good at understanding what the right technology is at solving the right problem. And they have the wrong people solving the problems, the wrong technology. They can't scale it, all this kind of stuff. And so educating people, which is one of the reasons why I do these podcasts, one of the reasons why I travel the world engaging with leadership, educating them to be able to make the right decisions is critical, because there is a lot of nonsense, which is again why I think organizations right now, if they do place the wrong bets over the coming 3 years, then they're not going to come back from that because the world is going to change rapidly. And I also am interested in helping individuals figure out how to augment AI with their own work, their own personal lives, to make sure that they are being as adaptive as possible.
There's an irony here that a lot of what you said there is a very similar conversation that we do have within education, which is instead of talking about what tools and how to deploy them, we need to start with why are we actually doing it and what we're trying to fix as a problem, and then make sure you've got the right people, typically educators, that are part of that co-production circle. And although it is clearly different, those common themes never really change, do they?
Indeed. I often, there's a really nice quote, I can't remember who said it, but they said, a problem well defined is half solved. And often people are not very good at defining the problem and then being honest with themselves about whether they have the capability or the talent within their organization has the capability of solving that problem because of this lack of education and foundational knowledge.
You've said about, you've referenced this already today, actually. Large language models are a crude representation of the brain that needs a power station, whereas the brain needs about 20 watts, I think you said. And at the same time, I think somebody said to me recently, you've got the Chinese state model, which is to take the American multi-billion-dollar produced large language models and replicate them for much, much less. So is the current path is it a dead end, really, the current path of AI development and large language models?
No, and I think, I controversially argue that large language models are a little bit like intoxicated graduates, and we are seeing them now graduating to like a master's level where they can do rudimentary reasoning. We're starting to see evidence of them being able to do science, so solve quite complex problems. In fact, I was on the Radio Times last night commenting on this incident where an AI has escaped its sandbox, hacked into a different system,
Hugging Face,
which requires intelligence at a level but above graduate level. And I do think in the next few years we'll have a postdoc level, and maybe by the end of this decade we'll have a professor in our pocket. Now, that's one trajectory in terms of how AIs are going to get smarter over the coming years. But the way that these models are built is a crude representation of our brain, and there are different innovations, there are different things that are coming that will allow us to build much more energy efficient, much more adaptable models, which will challenge this other. But I don't think there's a ceiling in terms of the intelligence of large language models. They are going to get smarter, but there are other ways of building AIs that allow us to be able to control them better, be more explainable in terms of how they think, and also more aligned with some sort of value system.
Is that predominantly chipset based in terms of approaches as much as it is about software based?
It's a great question. So if you Google the term neuromorphics, neuromorphics has a history in trying to build chips that mimic how our neurons process information with spikes. We don't multiply numbers together in our head like GPUs. We process spikes, and that requires a different kind of chipset. So there's been a lot of investment over the past 2 decades in hardware, but there have over the past 5-8 years been advances in the software layer. And actually, I think that if we get the software layer right, people will figure out what the right hardware is. We might even be able to get it working on GPUs and even quantum. So I'm interested in solving the software layer, and actually I can talk about some of the things that we're doing there to get people start to use these different types of architectures, and then I think that hardware will then follow.
So what's the big challenge? Because I'm interested in what you're doing, Daniel. But is the focus on how do we do what we're currently doing in a much more energy efficient way? Or is it how do we create the frameworks to continue that evolution from drunk graduate to a highly qualified professor level at a quicker pace?
There are these two trajectories. I think that there's taking current large language models and then introducing new mechanisms to bring down the costs, make them more energy efficient, all that kind of stuff. And that's more of a kind of top-down approach. But there are kind of fundamental bottom-up approaches which are different. So, I'm looking here right now because I have running on one of my machines something that actually revisits my master's project back in 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, where I created essentially a petri dish. It was like a fish tank, and I created the ingredients for things like being able to bite and move and mate, and what happened is I created all these different agents that were all sort of random brains, random bodies, so most of them ran out of energy and died. But sometimes one of those agents was able to see something, bite it, and then reproduce. And it would pass its genes onto the next generation. And over time, you would be able to evolve much more complex agents that are able to have predator-prey behavior, operate in complex environments. And so you can go from insect level brains and make them more complicated, and then create environments that allow you to control the behavior of those agents. And arguably, I think that that approach will, if a number of advances are made, will lead to much more adaptive, much more energy efficient AIs, because they're much more aligned to how biological brains work. In fact, the North Star for Conscium, the consciousness company that I spun out of WPP, is actually to solve machine consciousness. The hypothesis is that we are building incredibly intelligent zombie superintelligences, or building towards a zombie superintelligence, where we give it a goal and it will be hell-bent on achieving that goal despite our ability to control it. But the question that we're asking ourselves is, would a machine that understands pain, suffering, love, empathy be safer for humanity than a zombie superintelligence? Would it be an antivirus for some of the challenges that we might create in building ever more intelligent machines?
I'm at risk here of ruining all of Matt's really good questions that were planned on this one. But you keep saying interesting things to kind of, up until not that long ago, we'd all be talking about the Turing test, and we'd be talking about large language models and natural language processing, and how does something give us a sense of it? When you start talking about that broader sense of intelligence and emotions, what's the test that allows you to actually get a sense of that?
This is I'm flying to San Francisco on Sunday to present at the AGI conference. I'm opening the consciousness track there, and I'm going to sound very arrogant now, but I think I've got my head around consciousness, and I think it's the wrong question to solve. And because I don't think that anybody.
Well, I was trying.
Well, I have my own view, and actually I have a book that's coming out in the next.
That's handy. Good. Tell us more.
It's called Perspectives on Machine Consciousness. So all we've done is we've gathered together 30 of the world's leading thinkers in this field, and then tried to produce different perspectives. And I've written a chapter, and I actually. So just very, very quickly, there is an interesting relationship between intelligence and consciousness. There's a really good definition of intelligence, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. What you want to do is build systems and make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt themselves so they make better decisions next time. And we have evolved different features, abilities to allow us to be able to make predictions about the world and then adapt to those predictions. Things like language, our ability to do long-term planning, feeling, empathy. And there's a whole load of things that we've developed and evolved that allow us to be adaptive. And I argue that each one of those things is like a segment on a color wheel. And if you spin the color wheel, if you put it in motion, then what emerges if you have all of the colors is white. Now, there's a concept in consciousness theory called illusionism. Not that consciousness isn't real, but it's an emergent property of the interaction of this system that's in motion. And when you stop it and try and find consciousness, it disappears, just like white disappears if I stop the. And so I think that for me makes sense of consciousness. And I think that the real question is what number of segments, what type of segments and size segments do you need in what motion for a machine to suffer, to feel pain or anxiety? Because I think that's the problem that we're trying to solve for. So when you're observing something, it can report that it's behaving, it's suffering. It can tell you it's suffering. It can be flailing around and it might look like it's suffering, which is one suite of tests. But I think you also have to look at its internal physiology. You have to look at its brain patterns. Is it actually pretending to suffer? And this is why I'm excited about neuromorphics and spiking neural networks, because if we could try and find correlations between how real biological things suffer, we can look at their internal physiology and draw parallels between AIs. And if it looks externally like it's suffering, if it looks internally like it's suffering, then arguably it's suffering.
Just going to pause there and let all of that distill down. But that's a really, really good explanation. I love the spinning wheel and the white. It's a really good analogy.
Yeah, I think you wrote about that so much. I remember reading that.
I did, yeah. I've and again, I've got a more detailed chapter coming out in this book in the next few months.
I just asked something, Daniel, because I struggle with this. I mean, I'm not at the level of you two in terms of understanding this. I need more than a moment to pause and digest this out. But when you talk about your 7 singularities, and you've got technology and economics and political and legal and social and environmental and is it ethical?
Yeah.
Why is education not in there? Because education to me is at the root of everything.
Okay, so a singularity for me is a point in time that you can't see beyond. It's an event that then is very difficult to see what happens beyond that. And the reality is that the way that these 7 singularities came about was that the most popular singularity is often referred to as the technological singularity, which is where we build a brain 1,000,000 times smarter than us. A very good friend of mine coined the term the economic singularity, Callum Chase, which is the point in time where we automate the majority of human labor. I realized 7 years ago that there might be an environmental singularity, a point in time where we lose control of our environmental ecosystem, or we gain control of our ecosystem. And so these 3 words, technological, environmental, and economic, are part of the PESTLE analysis. So PESTLE is an extension to steeple, to PEST, and it's been extended now to steeple: social, technological, economic, environmental, legal, political, and ethical. And so I argue that there are these 7 macro singularities. Now, steeple is a nice framework to think about them, but the question I would kind of ask you is, with respect to education, what is that point in time? For me, it probably links to what I call the political singularity, which is the point in time where you can't know whether something's true or not. It's a post-truth world. And so you need to somehow solve that problem. And so, yeah, I guess I would turn the question around and ask you, what event associated with education would lead to some sort of singularity that we can't see beyond?
I mean, you're talking to someone who thinks that education is very unfit for purpose.
Yeah.
I think the ship has sailed, and I think Al is much more eloquent and articulate when he talks about this and writes books about it. But to me, we've reached that point.
So I guess for me, education helps us steer towards a more positive version of all of those things. So let's say we take the first one, which is the social singularity, a world where we cure death. So in a world where we cure death, how do we educate ourselves in that world? How do we deal with relationships? How do we understand how to find purpose? I think education is linked to all of the different singularities.
Is it not a mirror? That's the thing where, I mean, Matt's rightly very passionate, but I always think education is a mirror to, in your kind of conversation point, those other singularities, because it reflects on, firstly, whether it's an inclusive pathway that everybody can actually engage with and deliver on. It assigns whether those people end at a point where they can actually pass into some purposeful role on planet Earth, where they can actually both be fulfilled and fulfill some role in society, that kind of sense of purpose and agency. And there is also a sense of it is for me, education is the one thing that has to triangulate with all the forward thinking we do in our other disciplines, because it is like ducks in a fairground. We're shooting at ducks that are 15 years ahead for our learners as they enter match school in Cumbria before they come out the other end into the workplace. And so often what happens is we have all the deep thinking about all these other strands in society. And then we say, but education would better do something. And it's already out of date before we start. And so I mean, that's probably quite a clumsy way of trying to squeeze that into what you're talking about. But I kind of see it as quite a mirror on the gaps we have in society.
So I guess the argument here is that our society is moving so quickly. Technology is moving so quickly that our education system now can't keep up. I think maybe that's what is that right, Matt?
I think so. And I think within that as well, I don't think it's trying to keep up. We're curriculum review last year, was it, Al?
Yeah, but I think
team, and it's coming in 2028, and the speed of change means that whatever comes in 2028 that's been planned now is going to be.
I think in the education and skill space, though, Daniel, I mean, every quarter, wherever you are in the UK, there's labour market information drawn by constituent authorities, which reflects the skills needs of the businesses in those regions and the shortfall. And I sit on the combined authority board for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, so a fairly high research-driven, one of the engine rooms of UK PLC. And increasingly, there is a gap between the skills deficit that's being sought and what can be fulfilled locally. So we end up in much more of an international skills base. And then, so that means society, the education system, isn't keeping up with the accelerated pace of the workplace.
Yeah. I do have a view about this, and you both are much more educated than me. AI is relatively new to most people. It's 3 years old, and I think it's still difficult, I think, to predict how the impact it's going to have. Yes, we're going through an interesting, potentially bumpy phase, and I do think that beyond 5 years, nobody knows what they're talking about in terms of making predictions. And I do think it will reach a point where it can essentially free everybody from paid work, which could be either amazing or problematic. But from an education perspective, so I guess you can tell me if this rhetoric is true or false. But we've historically tried to impart knowledge, and then we test people whether they have that knowledge. And now knowledge is abundant. We can get knowledge from LLMs. And I guess what we value in each other isn't necessarily knowledge. Certainly what I value in graduates isn't knowledge. It's how they apply knowledge and how do they are creative about applying knowledge. How do they deal with ambiguous situations? How resilient are they? How curious are they? And what I would hope is that somehow, and I don't know whether our education systems are set up to do this, that they will, instead of testing for knowledge, we put students in situations where they have to apply the knowledge that we've imparted to help them understand how good they are at creativity, curiosity, and then help them develop those aspects of their.
Daniel, you are ticking some boxes and making people smile. Some of the things Matt and I talk about, and I was involved with the OECD on the Education for Human Flourishing, and that's about beyond the academic streams. How do we capture those soft skills, a sense of awe and wonder about the arts, all the things that Matt tries to broaden in the curriculum for his learners that give students. I was pushed back on the word agency because as soon as you step out of education, nobody knows what you mean. But that sense of how do we measure skills? Actually the workplace, that labour market information, if somebody arrives in one of your organisations, I suspect you'll want to know about their communication skills, their critical thinking skills, and maybe if they think differently, that might actually appeal to you rather than be and so there's a changing. I want to know what makes you not normal, what makes you different from the standard kind of, there's your list of grades.
What makes me not normal? First of all,
I'm not challenging you now. I mean, I'm expecting that's the question you're thinking when you're meeting people.
Yeah. No, exactly, and you're right. It's very hard to sort of test for that. But one of the things that I did do when I was at university is that I had the opportunity to go and learn at London Business School, so MBA style learning. And what I thought was quite good about that was that you would often do a case study where you presented the scenario, and then you got to discuss what decisions you would make, and then you would be presented then with a follow up, and these are the things that what happened. And that is a sort of a crude way of doing this, because it allows people to do scenario based learning, and perhaps there is a better place, and maybe AI can help us with this, where we can create these types of scenarios to test these other abilities.
I'm just conscious of time, Al. You include education in a list, I think you did, about what AI could make effectively free, Daniel, across, the world for society as a whole. But we already sort of have free school in this country and nobody thinks the problem is solved. So what does free education actually mean when you reference free education? Because I'm looking at AI as something that could address a lot of disadvantaged gaps. And Morecambe is obviously a very disadvantaged area, is a good example. But AI, as it's currently being used by education, is just going to increase a lot of these disadvantaged gaps and access to these opportunities.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was formulating these ideas, and when I was talking about, in this case, the concept of creating a world of abundance. So in theory, AI can help remove friction from the creation and dissemination of goods like food and healthcare and energy and maybe education. And when I was forming these ideas, this was before AI happened. And the question that I was asking myself was, how could you give everybody in the world access to the ability to get access to knowledge, to allow them to educate themselves from a knowledge perspective? And, arguably, if you have a phone or a laptop and access to the internet, then that becomes now free. But we now know that education isn't just about acquiring knowledge, it's about the application of that. And my hope is that as people do get access to more goods and services that are free, food and healthcare, let's assume that we get our timing right and we're able to remove the friction from the creation and dissemination of these things. It would free people up, like you, like me, to create innovations that allow you to help solve that problem that you described. So I could create, using AI, a platform that puts people in weird and wonderful scenarios like the Star Trek simulator, the holodeck, to not only test their knowledge, but test how they apply that knowledge in those weird and wonderful situations. And in theory, AI can allow us to create those platforms now at a fraction of the cost that they used to do. So maybe we're not quite there yet, but I would argue that if that was a problem we need to get solved from an education perspective, seeing how people apply knowledge and testing their critical thinking and things like that, then in theory, these platforms will pop up and they will become almost free.
They're going to have to, aren't they? Because what's the figure? Is it 40 million teachers needed by 2030 to address the education gap? It's not going to happen.
No,
so
exactly.
They kind of government level are going to have to consider AI as an alternative in some ways at some point, I hope.
Yeah, I knew we'd been missing Ask Jeeves, Matt. You see, that was the solution back then.
Yeah.
I mean, or, people might come up with new creative ways to allow them to educate themselves. And and I think we have to be honest about that and how that will challenge our existing education systems.
Yeah, I think there's some wise words in there, Daniel, because already we're seeing the concept of, well, if 25% of children are not in mainstream education already, at some point we'll figure that actually it's not about one size fits all. It's about 3, 4, 5, 6 different models of education that will suit different learners and different pathways. And we shouldn't be counting some as being more preferable or more valuable than the others if it allows young people to achieve. And that's something I know Matt's kind of challenging and pushing, and there's conversations around it. And on this series, over the last 2 series, we've been meeting lots of folks who are involved in curriculum, education design. And it always comes back to the same thing about how do we build more equity into the system, and ironically, when we talk at the very simplistic level around AI, people fear it in education. And we always say, well, it starts by actually giving more reason to learn literacy and oracy so that you can actually interact effectively with a large language model. And it's an amplifier for human skills, which means that if we do things right, maybe it actually creates a greater value of what makes us human most and what makes us different.
I agree. Actually, one of the things I ask people in all my talks at the end is, imagine you're living in a world of abundance where all of your food, your healthcare, it's all free, it's all available. Imagine that
would be in Scotland.
What would you do with your time? And the number one answer is usually I'm going to improve my golf handicap. But the second answer is I'm going to go and learn. I'm going to educate myself.
Lifelong learning.
I'm going to go and spend time and be a better gardener or be a better tennis player, and I'll look after my health. And so interestingly, if you take all of those constraints away from people, those economic constraints, they have an impulse to learn. And my hope is that that's a natural human drive, and if we apply our cards right, we'll free more people to give them access to the ability to live their true humanity, which I think is actually not just living for themselves, not just learning and playing better tennis and golf, but then actually enabling other people to do those things.
I love that. That's a lovely way to wrap up.
Finish.
Matt was right with his prediction. We could have spent 2 hours talking to you, and we might have to, with your blessing, invite you back for series 3 to continue the conversation. Could you just remind folks about your new book that's coming out so they can have a look at it?
It's called Perspectives on Machine Consciousness, and I'll send you a copy when it's done.
Bless you. Look forward
Thank you
to
very
that.
much for your time, Daniel.